Hello, and welcome to Haunted Slumber. Before we begin, take a moment to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from. I always enjoy reading them. If you enjoy slow, eerie stories that gently blur the line between peaceful sleep and the unknown, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfortable, let your body grow still, and allow the sounds of the outside world to quietly fade into silence. Tonight, the night grows deeper. Your thoughts begin to drift, and an old, haunting story quietly comes to life. So close your eyes, listen carefully, and let the darkness lull you into haunted slumber. Story 1. I opened my eyes and stared into the darkness, completely confused. For several seconds, I did not move. I did not even breathe properly. My mind felt slow and heavy, as though I had been asleep for days instead of only a few hours. I tried to remember where I was, but nothing around me looked familiar. The last thing I could remember was getting ready for bed. I had been suffering from a terrible headache all evening. It was the kind of pain that sat behind my eyes and spread across my forehead, making it difficult to think. I had taken some ibuprofen, turned off the lights, and laid down, hoping the pain would disappear while I slept. But this was not my bedroom. I slowly lifted my head and looked around. The movement made my neck ache, and for a moment, the world seemed to tilt. I placed my hands against the ground to steady myself. My fingers sank into something cold and wet. The ground beneath me was made of thick, heavy clay. It clung to my palms and pressed beneath my fingernails. When I pushed myself to my feet, my shoes left deep marks behind me. Every step made a soft, sucking sound, as though the earth did not want to let me go. I wiped my hands against my clothes and tried to understand what I was seeing. A forest surrounded the lake. The trees were tall, thin, and completely bare. Their branches stretched towards the sky like long, twisted fingers. A few dead leaves still clung to them, dry and brittle. But there was no wind to make them move. Everything stood perfectly still. The sky above me was almost completely black. Only a few weak stars shone through the darkness. There was no moon, no glow from a distant town, and no sign of morning coming. In front of me was a large lake. The water looked like spilled black ink. It was so dark that I could not tell where the surface ended and the night sky began. There was no breeze, yet the water moved gently in the distance, folding over itself in slow waves. I listened carefully. There were no insects, no birds, no animals moving through the trees. There was only silence. It should have frightened me, but strangely, it did not. At least, not at first. The quietness felt peaceful, safe even. It was as though the whole world had stopped, leaving me alone in a place where nothing could reach me. Then, I noticed the shipwreck. It rested near the edge of the lake, partly buried in the clay. It was old and badly damaged, with cracked wooden boards and a broken railing. Dark moss covered parts of the hull, and one side leaned lower than the other. It did not look as though it had moved in many years. I knew I should stay away from it. Every sensible thought in my mind warned me not to go closer. I did not know where I was, how I had arrived there, or whether the ship was safe. There could have been someone hiding inside. The wooden floor could collapse beneath me. The whole thing could slide into the water, but despite all of that, I felt drawn towards it. It was not simple curiosity. It was stronger than that. It felt as though the ship was calling me. I began walking before I had fully decided to move. The clay pulled at my feet with every step, making the short distance feel much longer. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing among the trees. But the forest remained empty. When I reached the side of the ship, I found a small wooden ladder leading to the deck. Some of the steps were cracked, but they looked strong enough to hold me. I placed one foot on the bottom step and climbed slowly. The ladder creaked beneath my weight. Each sound seemed too loud in the stillness. When I reached the top, I pulled myself onto the deck and froze. The wooden boards gave a low groan under my feet. That was when I realized I had been holding my breath. I let the air escape slowly from my lungs and stood still for a few moments, trying to calm myself. My hands had started shaking, although I did not remember becoming afraid. The deck was covered in dirt, dead leaves, and broken pieces of wood. A torn rope lay near the railing, wet and dark with age. There was no sail, no equipment, and no sign that anyone had been there recently. At the back of the boat was a small cabin. The door was slightly open. It leaned inward by only a few inches, as though someone had opened it and left it waiting for me. I stared at the dark space beyond the door. A cold feeling moved through my stomach, but the strange pull I had felt before became even stronger. I walked towards the cabin, stepping carefully to avoid the broken boards. When I reached the door, I placed my fingers against it and pushed. The hinges gave a quiet squeal. I stopped immediately and listened. Nothing answered. I pushed the door open a little farther, trying to make as little noise as possible. The silence was so complete that I felt as though everyone in the world could hear my breathing. I took half a step inside. My body remained tense, ready to pull back if anything moved. The cabin was small and almost empty. There was no furniture except for a narrow wooden table pushed against one wall. Dust covered the floor, and the air smelled of damp wood. I stepped fully into the room and waited for my eyes to adjust. At first, I saw only dark shapes. Then I noticed the walls. They were covered in picture frames. There were dozens of them, placed close together from the floor almost to the ceiling. Some were small and simple. Others were large and decorated with faded gold edges. A few hung sideways, while others had cracked glass. I moved closer to the nearest picture. It showed an elderly couple standing outside a house. They were smiling, but there was something uncomfortable about the way they looked at the camera. Their eyes seemed too wide, and their faces were strangely pale. The next picture showed a family sitting around a dinner table. A mother, a father, and 3 children. They looked normal, though none of them were smiling. Another frame held the portrait of a young woman wearing an old-fashioned dress. Another showed 2 men standing beside the lake. Some of the pictures seemed harmless, others did not. In one portrait, a man stood in front of a wall covered in blood. His clothes and hands were soaked in it, yet he was smiling calmly. Another picture showed a woman holding a knife. Blood covered her face and neck. She was not injured. She looked proud. There were photographs of people standing over bodies, families smiling beside open graves, children holding sharp tools with dark stains on them. The people in those pictures did not look afraid. They looked dangerous. A sick feeling formed in my stomach. Sweat gathered in my palms, and a cold shiver traveled down my spine. I suddenly felt as though the faces were watching me. Every pair of eyes seemed to follow my movements across the room. I took a step backwards. The floor creaked. For one horrible second, I thought one of the people in the pictures had moved. I turned quickly, rushed out of the cabin, and pulled the door shut behind me. The wood struck the frame with a heavy sound that echoed across the lake. I stood on the deck, breathing hard. Where was I? How had I come here? Was any of this real? I walked towards the railing and looked across the water. The black lake stretched far into the distance, surrounded by the lifeless trees. That was when I noticed another shipwreck. It was farther out in the lake and much more damaged than the first. Only half of it remained above the water. The broken front pointed upward at an angle, while the rest had disappeared beneath the surface. I narrowed my eyes, trying to see more clearly. Something stood on top of it. At first, I thought it was part of the broken mast. Then, it moved. It was a person. They stood at the highest point of the wreck, facing me. One arm lifted slowly into the air. They were waving. I stared at them, unsure what to do. Perhaps they were trapped. Perhaps they had been injured. Maybe they had been waiting for someone to find them. I felt my pockets, hoping to find my phone, but there was nothing there. I did not even have my keys or wallet. I had no way to call for help. My mouth had become dry. A sensible part of me said I should ignore the stranger. Nothing about this place made sense. The boat, the photographs, and the person standing silently on the distant wreck all felt wrong. But what if they really needed help? I imagined leaving them there and discovering later that they had died because I had done nothing. The guilt would follow me forever. I closed my hands into fists and felt pain in both palms. When I opened them, I saw 4 crescent-shaped marks in each hand. My fingernails had pressed so deeply into my skin that they had nearly broken it. I forced myself to breathe. I had to try. I looked around the deck for anything that might help me reach the other wreck. Near the side of the boat, I saw a small inflatable boat. A short paddle had been placed neatly inside it. I stared at it. It was already filled with air, already prepared, already waiting. The thought made me uneasy. It was as though everything had been arranged before I arrived. I almost laughed at myself. In a horror film, this would have been the moment when everyone watching shouted at the screen, telling the foolish person not to get into the boat. Yet I still picked it up. I carried it towards the ladder and dropped it onto the clay below. Before climbing down, I looked around one more time. The trees were empty. The deck was empty. The cabin door remained closed. I climbed down, dragged the inflatable boat to the edge of the water, and pushed it in. It floated gently on the dark surface. I climbed inside and picked up the paddle. The boat moved under my weight, making my stomach drop. I had never been on a boat before. Worse, I did not know how to swim. If the boat tipped over, I would be helpless. I hesitated. Was this really a good idea? No, it was a terrible idea, but the figure was still standing on the shipwreck, watching me. I began paddling. At first, I could not control the boat properly. It turned in circles, and the paddle kept slipping from my hands. After several tries, I managed to point it towards the wreck. The water was not calm anymore. Small waves pushed against the boat from different directions. Each one rocked me from side to side. I tried not to look down because I could not see anything beneath the surface. The wreck was not very far away, but the journey felt endless. As I moved closer, the person became clearer. A deep coldness passed through my body. The figure was dressed entirely in black. Black leather gloves covered their hands. They wore a black hooded sweatshirt, black trousers, and black shoes. A dark hat sat beneath the hood, a black ski mask covered their face, and dark glasses hid their eyes. Not one part of their skin was visible. My grip tightened around the paddle. I stopped the boat several yards from the wreck and looked up. "Are you okay?" I called. My voice sounded weak against the silence. The figure did not answer. "Do you need help?" "Nothing." "Are you hurt?" Still nothing. The person continued standing there, looking directly at me. From the height and build, I guessed it was a man, though I could not be certain. He was tall and broad-shouldered. He did not wave again. A strong warning feeling rose inside me. Every part of my body told me to leave. I placed the paddle into the water and began moving backwards. I did not turn the boat around. I wanted to keep watching him. He remained completely still. As I moved farther away, I kept glancing over my shoulder to make sure I was heading back towards land. The stranger did not follow. That should have made me feel better, but it did not. When I was halfway back, I looked at him again. He jumped into the water. There was no warning. One moment he stood on the wreck, and the next he disappeared beneath the black surface. A second later, his head appeared. He started swimming towards me. My heart slammed against my ribs. My pulse thundered in my ears so loudly that I could barely hear the water. I paddled as hard as I could. The inflatable boat rocked violently, and water splashed over the sides. The stranger moved quickly through the lake, cutting through the surface with powerful strokes. What was he doing? Why was he following me? Had he brought me here? The questions rushed through my mind so quickly that I could not hold on to any of them. I reached the shore and almost fell while climbing out. I abandoned the inflatable boat and ran towards the shipwreck I had explored earlier. My lungs burned. I climbed the ladder as quickly as I could and pulled myself onto the deck. I hurried towards the cabin and hid beside the wall, pressing my body against the dark wood. I tried to control my breathing. If he heard me, he would know exactly where I was. I looked over the edge of the deck. The man had reached the shore. He stood up slowly, water pouring from his black clothes. Then, he stretched his arms and shoulders as though he had just finished a relaxing swim on a warm day. The casual movement frightened me more than if he had run straight towards me. He was not worried that I might escape. He began walking towards the ship. I covered my mouth with one hand. My stomach twisted painfully. I did not know whether I was going to scream, vomit, or faint. My whole body shook, and my legs felt weak. The ladder creaked. He was climbing. A moment later, his head appeared above the deck. He pulled himself up and stood there, dripping water onto the wood. He did not look around. He already knew where I was. He walked slowly towards the cabin. Then he lifted one gloved hand and tapped on the wall. Tap, tap, tap. There was no rhythm to it. He was not trying to communicate. He was letting me know that he was close. He knew I was hiding nearby. He continued walking, tapping the wall every few steps. His head turned slightly in my direction. I lowered myself onto my hands and knees and began crawling towards the opposite side of the deck. I planned to move around the cabin, reach the ladder, and escape into the trees. But no matter which direction I moved, his head followed me. He could see me. Or perhaps he could hear every breath. He kept tapping the wall. Tap, tap, tap. He walked slowly because he knew there was nowhere for me to go. Fear tightened around my chest. Panic clawed at my thoughts until only one word remained. Run! I pushed myself to my feet and sprinted towards the ladder. Before climbing down, I looked back. He stood near the cabin watching me. He made no attempt to stop me. That was when I understood. He was playing with me. He wanted me to run. I jumped down the ladder, landed badly in the clay, and nearly fell. Pain shot through my ankle, but I forced myself forward. I ran towards the trees. The forest looked even darker from inside. The trunks stood close together, and the branches formed a tangled roof overhead. I did not go far because I was afraid I would become lost. I hid behind a thick tree and looked back towards the ship. The man jumped from the deck. He landed in the clay and immediately began sprinting towards the forest. He moved much faster than I expected. He was almost upon me. I turned and ran. Branches scratched my face and arms. Dead leaves cracked beneath my shoes. The trees seemed to shift around me, making every direction look the same. Why was this happening? Where was I? What did he want from me? I could hear him behind me. His footsteps were steady and controlled. He was not struggling for breath. He was not panicking. I was. I ran until the trees opened and the lake appeared in front of me again. I had gone in a circle. There was nowhere left to hide. The man emerged from the forest behind me. I looked at the black water and made a desperate decision. I jumped. The cold shocked my entire body. The water closed over my head, and for a moment, I could not move. I kicked wildly until my face broke through the surface. I gasped for air. I did not know how to swim, but panic forced my arms and legs to move. I slapped at the water, trying to pull myself farther from the shore. I looked back. The man stood at the edge of the lake. He slowed down. Then he stepped into the water and began swimming towards me. He moved calmly. His head stayed above the surface, and his body glided through the lake with hardly any effort. He watched me the way an alligator watches injured prey. I turned away and tried to swim faster. My movements were wild and useless. Water entered my mouth. My arms were already growing tired. I kept looking back. He was closer each time. The water rippled around him, but he was never in a hurry. He was enjoying it. He was watching me struggle and waiting for the moment when I had nothing left. "What do you want from me?" I screamed. My voice broke. He did not answer. There was only the sound of my hands striking the water and my desperate breathing. I turned away again and kicked harder. Then something closed around my ankle. I screamed. The man's gloved hand held me firmly beneath the water. I twisted and kicked, but his grip did not loosen. His other hand rose slowly above the surface. Something shiny reflected the faint light from the stars. At first, I could not understand what I was seeing. Then my eyes adjusted. It was a carving knife. The blade was long and bright. Water ran down its edge. The sight of it destroyed the last of my hope. I had nowhere left to go. I could not swim away. I could not fight him. No one knew where I was. I stopped struggling. My arms fell to my sides. I let myself sink. The cold lake closed over my head, wrapping around me like heavy fabric. The water pulled me down, making me feel heavy and weightless at the same time. I held my breath for as long as I could. Then my body forced me to inhale. Cold water rushed into my mouth and lungs. Pain exploded through my chest. My vision blurred. The weak stars above became shaking points of light. Through the darkness, I saw the man dive beneath the surface. He still held the knife. He pulled his arm back, preparing to strike. The blade moved towards me. Just before it reached my body, everything turned black. I opened my eyes. I was still holding my breath. I sat up so quickly that my head spun. My hands flew over my chest, stomach, arms, and legs, searching for blood or wounds. There was nothing. I looked around. I was in my bedroom. The curtains were closed. My phone rested beside me. A glass of water sat on the table. The empty packet of ibuprofen was exactly where I had left it. I was lying in the same place where I had fallen asleep after taking the medicine for my headache. My skin felt as though it were buzzing. Sweat covered my face and ran down my back. My shirt clung to my body, and my heart still hammered painfully inside my chest. I forced myself to breathe slowly. It had only been a nightmare. That was all, a terrible, realistic nightmare caused by the headache, the medicine, or stress. I repeated that thought several times. Then I looked down at my hands. 4 crescent-shaped marks were pressed into each palm. My fingernails had dug deeply into my skin. I stared at them for a long time. Somewhere outside my room, I heard a soft sound. Tap, tap, tap. Story 2. I can't sleep. I don't mean that in the usual way. I don't mean I lie awake for a few hours, staring at the ceiling while my mind refuses to slow down. I don't mean I toss and turn until morning or wake up feeling tired because I only slept for an hour or two. For me, not sleeping has become something else. It has become a state that I enter every night. The same thing happens whenever I lie down. My body falls asleep almost immediately, as if it has been waiting all day to shut itself off. My arms become heavy. My breathing slows. My muscles stop responding. It happens so quickly that sometimes I don't even have time to finish a thought. But my mind does not follow. My body sleeps, but I stay awake inside it. I remain trapped behind my closed eyes, fully aware of the room around me. At first, everything feels normal. I hear the soft hum of the ceiling fan. I hear my husband breathing beside me. I hear the occasional movement of a car outside or the old wooden floor settling somewhere in the house. Then, slowly, the room begins to change. It never changes in a clear or dramatic way. Nothing suddenly appears at the foot of the bed. The walls do not move. The furniture stays where it is. There is never one obvious thing I can point to and say, that is wrong. Instead, the wrongness builds slowly. It feels like small mistakes collecting in the darkness. The shadows seem heavier on the left side of the bed. The ceiling feels lower than it should, as if it has dropped a few inches while I wasn't looking. The air becomes thick and strange. Every breath feels as though I am pulling something into my lungs that is not completely air. Sometimes the room seems too quiet. Other times I can hear tiny sounds that I know do not belong there. Soft tapping inside the walls. A faint dragging noise beneath the floor. A whisper so low that I cannot understand the words. I always try to move. I tell myself to lift a finger, turn my head, or open my eyes. I give my body simple commands, but it does not listen. I am trapped inside myself, awake and helpless, while the darkness around me becomes more real than the room I remember. Then, suddenly, I wake up. At least, I think I do. My eyes open. I can move again. I sit up in bed, breathing hard, and look around. Everything appears normal. The bedside lamp is where it should be. My husband is usually asleep beside me. The clock shows some hour deep in the night. I get out of bed. I walk through the house. I go to the bathroom. I drink water from the kitchen. I turn on a small light because the darkness feels too heavy. Everything works. Every object is solid. Every room looks familiar. It all feels real enough that I never question it at first. That is the worst part. I never know immediately that something is wrong. The differences are always small. Once, I walked into the kitchen and noticed that the clock above the refrigerator was moving backwards. The second hand clicked in reverse, slowly removing time instead of counting it. I watched it for nearly a minute. I remember feeling confused, but not afraid. My mind accepted it too easily. I told myself the battery must be dying, even though I knew clocks did not behave that way when their batteries became weak. Another night, I woke up and found every door in the house standing open. The bedroom door, the bathroom door, the spare room, the closet, the front door, and even the back door leading into the yard were all wide open. I clearly remembered locking the front and back doors before bed. I stood in the hallway, staring at them. Cold air came from the open rooms, but nothing moved. There was no wind. No curtains shifted. The house remained completely silent. I closed every door and returned to bed. In the morning, I remembered doing it, but all the doors were locked as if they had never been opened. My phone is usually where the strangest things happen. I often find messages marked as read even though I never opened them. Sometimes there are missed calls with no phone numbers attached. Other times the call history is completely empty. Even though I remember speaking to someone earlier that day. Once, I found a message written in my notes app. It said, "Stop checking." There was no date, no time, no title. I stared at it for a long time, trying to remember writing it. Then my phone screen went black. When it came back on, the note was gone. These details are always small enough to make me question myself. They are never large enough to prove anything. A strange clock, an open door, a missing note, a light that switches off when I enter the room. Each one could have an explanation, but together they create something impossible to ignore. What frightens me most is that no one else reacts. My husband never seems surprised. He moves through these strange nights as if everything is completely normal. He wakes up, walks around, speaks to me, and looks at me with an expression I cannot understand. Sometimes it seems like pity. Sometimes it looks like impatience. Most of the time, he looks at me as though I am late for something I do not remember agreeing to. One night, I woke up sitting at the kitchen table. I did not remember leaving the bedroom. My husband was standing near the sink with his back to me. The kitchen was dark except for the weak yellow light above the stove. I asked him what time it was. He did not answer. I asked him again, and he slowly turned his head toward me. His face looked normal, but his eyes seemed empty. Not black or unnatural, just empty, as if no one was behind them. I tried to laugh. I said, "Did I actually sleep tonight?" He looked directly at me and said, "You never really wake up." I laughed again. It was not because I found the words funny. It was the kind of laugh people make when they are uncomfortable and do not know how else to respond. He did not laugh with me. He did not smile. He just kept staring. I asked him what he meant, but he turned back toward the sink. He stood there without moving. The water was running, but his hands were dry. I returned to the bedroom. The next morning I asked him about it. He looked confused. He said he had slept through the whole night. After that, I started testing things. At first, I kept a notebook beside the bed. Before going to sleep, I wrote the date and time. I also wrote simple sentences such as, "You are awake now," or, "If the clock moves backwards, this is not real." I wanted proof. I wanted something that could survive between one state and the next. The first night, I woke up and found the notebook open on my chest. The pages were blank. Every sentence I had written was gone. The second night, I wrote more firmly, "If you are reading this, you are asleep." I underlined the words several times. When I woke up, the notebook was missing. I searched the entire bedroom. I looked under the bed, inside the drawers, beneath the pillows, and behind the furniture. I could not find it anywhere. In the morning, it was back on the bedside table. The message was still there. But I remembered seeing the pages blank. I started recording audio on my phone before sleeping. I would say the date, the time, and exactly what I planned to do if I woke up during the night. Then I would leave the recording running. The next morning the file would be gone. Sometimes the phone would say I had never recorded anything. Other times the recording existed, but it contained only silence. Once, I found an audio file that lasted nearly 6 hours. I played it through headphones. For the first several hours, there was nothing except the quiet sound of breathing. Then, near the end, I heard my own voice. It was very faint. I was whispering, "Not again." After that, another voice answered. It sounded like me, but deeper. It said, "You never reach the end." The file disappeared before I could play it again. I tried taking pictures. I placed objects in unusual positions before sleeping. I moved a chair into the middle of the room. I balanced a glass on the floor. I tied a piece of thread around the door handle. Every morning, everything was back in its proper place. But I always remembered seeing the changes during the night. I began losing track of which version of the house was real. Some mornings the hallway looked longer than usual. Other mornings the bathroom mirror seemed slightly too wide. Once I counted 9 steps from the bedroom to the kitchen, even though it normally took 12. The next day, it took 12 again. I stopped trusting distances. I stopped trusting time. Days became difficult to separate from nights. I would be at work and suddenly wonder whether I had actually woken up. I would look at the clock, check my messages, or count the doors in the hallway. Everything would seem normal. But now I understood that normal meant nothing. These states always felt normal at first. My husband noticed that I was becoming anxious. At least, I think he noticed. He asked why I kept staring at him. I told him I sometimes dreamed that he said strange things to me. He smiled and asked what kinds of things. I told him about the kitchen. I told him that he had said I never really woke up. His smile disappeared. For a moment, he looked afraid. Then he said, "You should stop trying to remember." I asked him why. He blinked, and his face returned to normal. He laughed and said he had only been joking, but I knew he had not. I began sleeping with the lights on. It did not help. The room still changed. The shadows remained even when every lamp was burning. They collected in corners where there should have been light. The ceiling still seemed lower. The air still became thick. Some nights, I heard footsteps walking through the house. They always stopped outside the bedroom door. The door never opened. I would lie there, unable to move, listening to something stand on the other side. Sometimes it breathed. Sometimes it scratched softly at the wood. Once it whispered my name. It used my husband's voice. A few nights ago, I woke up in the hallway. The house was completely dark. I could hear someone crying in the bedroom. I walked toward the sound. The door was partly open. Inside, I saw myself lying on the bed. My body was sleeping beside my husband. I stood in the hallway, watching myself. I could see my chest rising and falling. My eyes were closed. My face looked calm. My husband opened his eyes. He looked directly at me. Then, he placed one finger against his lips. I ran. I do not remember where I went. I only remember waking again in bed. Since then, I have been terrified that I am no longer inside my body at all. Maybe the thing that wakes and walks through the house is only part of me. Maybe my body is still lying in bed, trapped in a sleep that never ends. Or maybe the person in the bed was the dream, and I am the thing wandering outside it. I do not know anymore. Today was when I finally stopped trying to explain it. I tried to leave the house. It was morning, or at least the windows showed daylight. My husband had gone to work. The house was quiet. I needed to get outside. I thought fresh air might help. I thought standing in the street, seeing other people, hearing traffic, and feeling sunlight on my skin might prove that I was awake. I walked to the front door. I turned the handle. Nothing happened. The door was not locked. I checked the chain. It was open. I checked the deadbolt. It moved normally. I pulled the handle again. The door did not move. It felt less like a closed door and more like a picture of a door painted onto the wall. I pushed harder. Still nothing. I tried the back door. The same thing happened. I opened a window, but there was no outside. Beyond the glass was a flat gray surface. It did not look like fog. It looked solid, as if the world ended a few inches beyond the wall. I stepped away from it. My hands were shaking. I went back to the front door and pressed my palm against the wood. That was when I felt something on the other side. It was not wind. It was not rain. It was not a person. Something pressed back. The pressure moved slowly against my hand, almost like breathing. The door expanded slightly beneath my palm, then pulled away. A few seconds later, it pressed forward again. In, out, the whole house seemed to breathe with it. The walls made soft cracking sounds. The floor rose slightly under my feet. The ceiling bent downward. I understood then that there was no outside. At least, not one I could reach. Reality itself seemed to be pressed against the house, wrapped tightly around it, keeping me inside. I was not having nightmares. I was not waking up into different dreams. I was trapped in one continuous state, a dream that did not restart when I opened my eyes. It simply became deeper. Every false awakening had carried me farther down. Every strange detail had been another layer. Every time I believed I had finally woken up, I had only moved into the next part. I do not know how long this has been happening. Maybe it has been days, maybe years. Maybe I am still experiencing the first night, trapped inside a few seconds that feel endless. I am in the bathroom now. The door is locked. The lights are off because I saw movement in the mirror. My phone is shaking in my hand. I can hear my husband walking through the house. I heard the front door open a few minutes ago, even though it would not open for me. He called my name. His voice sounded normal. Then he called again. The second time, his voice came from the hallway. The third time, it came from inside the bathroom. I am trying not to look toward the mirror. There is something standing behind me in the reflection. I can feel it, even with my eyes fixed on the phone. The bathroom door is moving slightly in its frame. Someone is pressing against it from the other side. Slowly, in, out, like breathing. There is one thought I cannot escape. I have written this before. The same words, the same warning, the same desperate request for help. I remember sitting in this bathroom with the lights off. I remember hearing my husband outside the door. I remember typing everything that had happened. I remember reaching this exact point. But I do not remember what happened after. Maybe I never finish. Maybe something always stops me before I can send it. Or maybe I do send it, but the message never reaches anyone. Maybe it disappears like the notes, the recordings, and the pictures. Maybe I wake up again and forget everything. That would explain why the fear always feels new. That would explain why I keep repeating the same mistakes. I think I've been moving through this cycle for a very long time. I sleep. I wake. I notice something wrong. I try to leave. I remember. Then I forget. And it begins again. But this time feels different. The message is still here. The words are not disappearing. For the first time, I think I may have pushed something through. I think this may be reaching somewhere beyond the house, beyond the dream, beyond whatever is keeping me here. So, if anyone is reading this, please do not ignore it. Please understand that I am not telling a story. I am trying to leave evidence. I am trying to create something that will remain after I forget. Maybe someone can find me. Maybe someone can wake me. Maybe there is a way to reach through whatever separates this place from the real world. I do not know where my body is. I do not know how long I have been asleep. I do not even know whether I am still alive. The handle is turning now. The lock is still closed, but the handle keeps moving. My husband is whispering outside the door. He keeps saying that it is time to come back to bed. There is another voice speaking with him. It sounds exactly like mine. It is telling me that none of this is real. It is telling me to delete the message. It is telling me that I will feel better when I stop trying to remember. I will not delete it. I will keep typing for as long as I can. If this message reaches anyone, save it. Copy it. Send it somewhere else. Do not let it disappear. Because if I am right, and this actually made it out, then something has changed. It means I finally managed to break through. It means there may be a small opening between this place and yours. But I am afraid that openings work both ways. The breathing behind the door has stopped. The house is completely silent. The figure in the mirror is closer now. I can see its hand resting on my shoulder, but I cannot feel it. My phone screen is growing darker. The words are beginning to blur. I can hear someone whispering directly beside my ear. They are saying I have reached this point before. They are saying I always believe it is the first time. They are saying I never reach the end. Please, if you are reading this, help me. Do not let me forget again. Do not let this message disappear. Please, oh God. Please help me. Story 3. I had always found mountain peaks fascinating. From the ground, they looked like another world, rising far above the clouds into a place where almost nothing could survive. The highest parts of those mountains were so cold, empty, and lacking in oxygen that even plants and animals could not live there. Only the toughest microorganisms had any chance of surviving in those conditions. That was part of what attracted me to them. On a mountain, there were no busy streets, no crowds, and no noise from everyday life. There was only the wind, the ice, the stone, and the sound of your own breathing. The higher you climbed, the farther away the rest of the world seemed. It was dangerous, of course. I understood that from the beginning. One mistake could mean a broken leg, a fatal fall, or a slow death in the cold. But the danger made it more exciting. For several years, I trained on smaller mountains. I learned how to move across ice without wasting energy. I practiced using ropes, climbing tools, and oxygen equipment. I taught myself how to recognize the first signs of frostbite and altitude sickness. I spent nights in freezing tents, forcing my body to rest while wind shook the fabric around me. Every climb was preparation for one mountain, K2. It was the mountain I had dreamed about since I first became serious about climbing. It was only slightly shorter than Everest, but it was much more dangerous. The slopes were steeper, the weather was less predictable, and the route offered very few safe places to rest. Avalanches could happen without warning. Rocks could break loose and fall from above. Some of the exposed stone was sharp enough to cut through gloves, ropes, and clothing. Many experienced climbers had died there. I knew all of that, but I believed I was ready. Looking back, I think that was my first mistake. I chose a time when no other climbing teams were expected to begin an ascent. Several groups had already reached the upper camps and were making their way down, but no one was scheduled to follow me toward the summit. I liked the idea of having the mountain mostly to myself. It made the climb feel more personal. I flew to Pakistan, gathered the last of my supplies, and traveled toward the mountain. By the time I reached the base, K2 was already visible above everything else. Its upper slopes disappeared in the white cloud, and its dark rock faces looked almost black beneath the snow. The mountain did not look welcoming. It looked like something that had been waiting. Before beginning the climb, I checked my equipment again and spoke with several local residents and porters who knew the routes. They warned me about sudden weather changes and told me not to trust the calm sky. Some of them had spent years near the mountain. They spoke about K2 differently from the way climbers did. Climbers called it difficult. The local people called it hungry. I assumed that was only a way of respecting the mountain and remembering the many lives it had taken. I paid my respects to the dead before leaving the base. There were memorials for climbers who had never returned. Some bodies were still somewhere high above us, frozen into the mountain. Recovery was often too dangerous, so the dead remained where they had fallen. I remember standing there for several minutes, reading names and dates. Then I began climbing. It was only my second major climb without a guide. I had completed difficult routes before, and I trusted my training. I chose the Abruzzi Spur, the standard route used by most climbers. People often called it the safest way to the summit, though the word safe did not really belong anywhere on K2. The first part of the journey went well. The weather stayed clear, and the wind was lighter than expected. I moved slowly and carefully, carrying only what I needed. Each day I climbed higher, rested, and allowed my body to adjust to the thin air. As the altitude increased, every movement became more difficult. My legs felt heavier. My breathing became louder inside my mask. Even simple tasks, such as fastening a rope or opening a food packet, required concentration. I passed several climbers who were coming down. Most of them looked exhausted, but relieved. They warned me about loose rock higher up and told me that the wind had been growing stronger near the summit. Still, they said the route was possible if the weather remained calm. One small group stopped near me for several minutes. There were 3 climbers, all experienced and well-equipped. 2 of them spoke very little, but the third man kept looking back up the slope. He asked if I was climbing alone. When I said yes, his expression changed. "You should keep your radio close," he told me. I said I would. He looked over his shoulder again. "Did you see anyone above us?" I told him I had not. The man stared toward the rocks, even though there was nothing there. "We kept feeling like someone was following us," he said. "Not close enough to see clearly. Just movement. A shape near the edge of the snow." One of his companions told him to stop talking about it. The third climber laughed nervously and blamed it on exhaustion. Before leaving, the man leaned toward me. "If you see a light at night, don't follow it." Then they continued downward. I stood there for a while watching them disappear below the ridge. At the time, I thought altitude sickness had affected them. Climbers sometimes saw things that were not there. Lack of oxygen could cause confusion, fear, and hallucinations. It was dangerous, but it was not unusual. I continued upward. The climb became harder after that. I crossed steep sections of rock and ice where one careless step would have sent me falling hundreds of feet. My hands began to ache from the cold, even through thick gloves. 2 fingers on my left hand became numb for several hours. I knew it might be the beginning of frostbite. Still, I kept going. For reasons I still do not fully understand, I became obsessed with reaching the summit. Every warning sign felt unimportant compared with the thought of standing at the top. The mountain remained strangely calm. There were no major avalanches. No heavy snow fell. The clouds moved around the peak, but the sky above me often stayed clear. The silence was almost unnatural. Several times I felt as though I was being watched. I would stop climbing and look behind me, expecting to see another person. There was never anyone there. Once, near an exposed ridge, I thought I saw something moving below. It looked like a person standing beside a section of dark rock. The shape was too far away to identify, and when I looked again, it was gone. I blamed the light. The higher I climbed, the more tired I became. My vision sometimes blurred, and I had trouble focusing on small objects. I knew I should turn back if my condition became worse, but I was close. On the final day, I forced myself upward through the last section. Every breath burned. My legs trembled, and my fingers felt stiff inside my gloves. Then, at last, there was nowhere higher to climb. I stood on the summit of K2. For a few moments, I forgot the pain. The world stretched out below me, covered in cloud and snow. Other mountains rose in every direction, but from where I stood, they seemed smaller. The sky looked darker than it did at sea level, and the sun was painfully bright. I felt as if I were standing close to the edge of space. It was the second highest point on Earth, one of the closest places to the stars that a person could reach without leaving the planet. I thought about every climb that had brought me there. I thought about the years of training, the fear, and the people who had told me I was taking too great a risk. For a few minutes, I believed it had all been worth it. Then I began the descent. That was when the mountain changed. The weather turned with almost no warning. Clouds closed around the summit, and the wind began to scream across the slope. Snow struck my goggles so hard that I could barely see. Within minutes, the clear mountain had disappeared beneath a violent white storm. I tried to move quickly, but descending too fast would have been even more dangerous. The route was steep, and the snow covered the tracks and ropes I had used earlier. The wind pushed against me from different directions. At times, I had to press myself against the ice just to avoid being thrown off balance. I checked my location. and realized I was halfway between two camps. The nearest safe shelter was still too far away. I had no choice but to stop. I found a small area beside a wall of rock where the wind was slightly weaker. My hands shook as I set up my emergency tent. The shelter was not designed for a storm that powerful, but it was better than remaining outside. Snow blew through small gaps around the entrance. The tent fabric snapped and pulled against its supports. I placed my pack against one side to stop it from collapsing. The temperature dropped rapidly. My body had already used most of its strength during the climb. I could not feel several of my fingers, and my feet were becoming numb. I had no safe way to make a fire. Even if I had, the wind and thin air would have made it almost impossible to keep one burning. I wrapped myself in every layer I had and waited. The cold continued to enter the tent. At first, I shivered violently. Then the shaking slowly weakened. That frightened me. I knew enough about hypothermia to understand that when the shivering stopped, it did not mean the body was getting warmer. It meant the body was losing the ability to fight. I tried to stay awake. I spoke aloud to myself. I counted backward. I checked my watch again and again, though only a few minutes passed each time. The storm roared outside like an enormous animal. Then I saw a light. At first, I thought it was a reflection inside my goggles. I wiped them and looked again. The light was still there. It moved slowly through the storm, coming from farther down the mountain and traveling toward me. It was not the white beam of a modern headlamp. It was warmer, almost golden. The light moved from side to side, as if it came from an old lantern being carried by someone walking through the snow. I remembered the climber's warning. If you see a light at night, don't follow it. But I was not following it. It was coming to me. As the light grew closer, something strange happened. I began to feel warmer. The temperature inside the tent could not have changed, but the pain in my fingers became less severe. My breathing slowed. The lantern reached the entrance of my shelter. I expected to hear boots crushing the snow, but the storm was too loud. I could not hear anything except the wind. A hand pushed the entrance aside. The lantern appeared first. It was made of dark metal and old glass. A golden flame burned inside it, brighter than any normal flame I had seen. The person carrying it placed it near me. Warmth spread through the tent. I looked up at the stranger. She was a woman. I could only see her as a dark outline against the storm. She was slim and had long hair that moved gently around her shoulders. What disturbed me most was her clothing. She was not wearing proper climbing gear. No heavy coat, no oxygen mask, no helmet, no thick gloves. Her clothes looked thin and dark, though the blowing snow made the details difficult to see. She should not have survived at that altitude for more than a few minutes. Before I could speak, she turned her head toward the slope above us. Then, I heard her voice. It was soft and feminine, but somehow it passed through the roar of the storm without effort. "You should pack your shelter," she said. "The snow above you is about to collapse." I stared at her. She pointed upward. Through the moving snow, I saw the shape of the slope above the rocks. A heavy section of snow had formed along the edge. Even in the poor visibility, I could see cracks spreading across it. An avalanche could begin at any moment. "I'll guide you down," she continued. "I only need my lantern back." I handed it to her immediately. The warmth left the tent as soon as she took it, but fear gave me new energy. We worked quickly to pull down the shelter. The woman moved with surprising speed. She rolled the tent neatly and handed it to me. Her fingers touched the fabric near my hand. There was no warmth in them. Even through my gloves, I felt a cold so sharp that it seemed to pass straight into my bones. I nearly dropped the tent. The woman turned away before I could ask her anything. The lantern glowed in her hand. "Stay close," she said. I followed her. We had only moved a short distance when the slope behind us collapsed. The sound was deeper than thunder. Snow and ice poured down across the place where my tent had been. The rocks disappeared beneath it. If I had stayed there another minute, I would have been buried. The woman did not look back. She continued down the mountain, holding the lantern at her side. I followed the golden light. At times, the storm became so thick that I could not see her body. Only the lantern remained visible. It moved through the white darkness, always several steps ahead of me. I tried to call out to her. I asked her name. She did not answer. I asked where she had come from and whether she belonged to another climbing team. Again, there was no response. The lantern guided me around hidden drops and across dangerous sections of ice. More than once, the woman changed direction moments before a section of snow broke loose. She seemed to know the mountain perfectly. We passed the remains of several camps. Some had been abandoned for the season. Others were damaged by wind and snow. I recognized equipment half buried beneath the ice. The woman never stopped. The hours passed slowly. Night came, though it was difficult to tell because the storm had already turned the world dark. My legs weakened, and I stumbled several times. Finally, I told her I could not continue. She stopped. The lantern hung perfectly still in her hand. "There is a safe place nearby," she said. She led me behind a group of rocks where the wind was weaker. Together, we set up my tent again. I expected her to leave, but she helped secure the ropes and supports. When everything was ready, she placed the lantern beside me. "You need warmth," she said. I wanted to ask her to stay. Before I could speak, she stepped away from the entrance. The darkness swallowed her. I crawled inside the tent and held my hands near the lantern. The flame burned without smoke. It made no sound. Still, the heat from it was strong enough to warm the shelter. For the first time since the storm began, I felt safe. I fell asleep almost immediately. When I woke, the storm had ended. Sunlight passed through the tent fabric, and the mountain outside was silent. The lantern sat beside me. The flame was gone. The woman had disappeared. I went outside and searched the area. There were no footprints in the snow except mine. I looked around the rocks and called out, but no one answered. There was no sign that another person had ever been there. I returned to the tent and examined the lantern. There was no oil inside it. There was no candle, no fuel container, and no soot on the glass. The metal was so cold that it hurt to touch. At the bottom of the lantern, where the flame had burned, there was a small white object. I removed it carefully. It was a bone. It looked clean and perfectly preserved. One end was darkened, as though it had been burned, but there was no ash around it. I placed the bone back inside the lantern. Then, I continued down the mountain. The rest of the descent took several days. The weather remained calm, but I never stopped looking for the woman. At night, I sometimes thought I saw a faint golden light far above me. It always disappeared when I looked directly at it. When I finally reached the bottom, I asked everyone I could find whether they had seen a woman carrying a lantern. No one had. The workers at the lower camps told me that no woman had climbed past them during the storm. No rescue team had been sent. No one was missing from any of the groups. I described her clothing and long hair. One older porter became very quiet. He looked at the lantern but refused to touch it. When I asked what was wrong, he told me that people sometimes saw lights high on the mountain. Some followed them and survived. Others followed them and were never seen again. He would say nothing more. I kept the lantern. After returning home, I sent it to a friend who worked with DNA testing and bone identification. I did not tell him the full story at first. I only asked him to examine the lantern and the bone. Several weeks later, he called me. His voice sounded uncomfortable. He said he had found no usable DNA on the lantern except mine. That made no sense. The woman had carried it for hours with her bare hands. She had also moved my tent and touched parts of my equipment. There should have been something. Skin cells. Hair, sweat, anything. There was nothing. Then he told me about the bone. It was human. The bone came from someone who had died on K2. I asked how he could know that, but he would not explain everything. He only said that records and previous samples had allowed him to make a match. He refused to give me the person's name. He also told me something else. The bone remained extremely cold. He had kept it in a warm laboratory for days, but its temperature barely changed. When placed near other objects, it made them colder too. The dark mark on the bone was not normal burning. According to him, the bone appeared to have been used as fuel, though he could not understand how. He asked me where I had found it. I finally told him the truth. I described the storm, the avalanche, the woman, and the golden lantern. I explained that she had guided me down the mountain and disappeared before morning. He stayed silent for a long time. Then he said, "Based on what you described, she should have been dead before she reached the first camp." I knew he was right. No human being could have survived that cold without proper clothing. No one could move so easily at that altitude without oxygen or equipment. No person could walk through a blizzard without leaving tracks. And yet, she had saved my life. I still have the lantern. I keep it locked inside a metal case. Most of the time, it remains dark and empty. But on very cold nights, the glass sometimes becomes warm. Once I woke and found a faint golden glow inside it. The bone was burning again. There was no smoke, no smell, and no visible flame. Still, a weak light filled the room. That was when I made my decision. I continued mountain climbing. Most people assumed the experience on K2 would make me stop. Instead, it made me more determined. I climbed other mountains and returned to high places whenever I could. I told myself I wanted to understand what had happened. I wanted to meet the woman again and ask her who she was. I wanted to know why she saved me and why the lantern contained the bone of someone who had died on K2. I would have accepted any answer, even one that made no sense. So far, I have never seen her again. But sometimes, when I climb alone and the weather begins to change, I see a golden light moving through the snow far above me. It never comes closer. It only waits. And each time I see it, I have to decide whether to follow. Story 4. I have a lot of problems in my life. Then again, who doesn't? Everyone has something they are dealing with. Some people have money problems. Some have family problems. Others struggle with anxiety, loneliness, or things they never speak about. My biggest problem, however, was the thing that eventually killed me. A seizure. Thanks a lot, epilepsy. I know that sounds like a strange way to talk about death, but dark humor has always been one of the ways I deal with things. When your own brain can suddenly turn against you without warning, you either learn to laugh about it sometimes, or you spend every day terrified. Most days, I did both. I was around 17 when all of this happened. I had been living with epilepsy for long enough to know most of my triggers. Lack of sleep was one. Bright, flashing lights could sometimes cause problems. Missing my medication was obviously dangerous. But stress was the biggest trigger for me. That worked perfectly with my anxiety. I was already the kind of person who worried about everything. I worried about school, my family, my health, my future, and sometimes things that had not even happened yet. Then I would worry that all the worrying might cause a seizure, which only made me more stressed. It was a wonderful little cycle. People often told me to relax. Stop thinking about it. You're making yourself nervous. You're being paranoid. You'll be fine. Those words usually came from doctors, family members, teachers, or friends. Most of them meant well, but that did not make it less frustrating. They said those things as if relaxing were as easy as turning off a light. They acted like I could simply decide not to be afraid of losing control of my own body. None of them knew what it was like. They did not know what it felt like to wake up with no memory of what had happened. They did not know the fear of realizing that your body had been moving while your mind was somewhere else. They did not know the pain afterward, the confusion, or the embarrassment of seeing people staring at you. They certainly did not know what it felt like to wonder whether the next seizure would be the one you did not wake up from. It always annoyed me when people acted as if they understood everything about me and my condition. They gave advice with complete confidence while knowing nothing about the reality of it. Sorry, I'm getting distracted again. I have always done that. I begin telling one story. Then my mind takes 3 different roads before returning to the point. I suppose that habit followed me into death. The night it happened was a Saturday. It had been a normal day, or at least as normal as my days ever were. Nothing especially terrible had happened. I had not missed any medication. I had not stayed awake all night. I had not done anything obviously dangerous. That evening, I was sitting in the living room with my family. We had decided to watch a film together. I cannot remember which film it was now. I have tried many times to remember, but every time I reach for the memory, it disappears. Maybe it was a comedy. Maybe it was some action movie my father had chosen. Maybe it was one of those films that everyone agrees to watch even though no one really cares about it. I remember the room more clearly than the film. The curtains were closed. The lights were low. The television threw pale colors across the walls. Someone had left a half-empty glass on the table. My mother was sitting nearby. And I remember hearing one of my family members laugh at something on the screen. I had taken my medication earlier, so I believed I would be safe for the rest of the night. Famous last words, right? At some point during the film, I started to feel strange. It was not always easy to explain the feeling that came before a seizure. Sometimes there was no warning at all. Other times, there was a brief moment when the world felt wrong. The room seemed both too close and too far away. The voices around me became unclear. It sounded as if everyone was speaking from the other side of a wall. I tried to focus on the television. The image on the screen stretched strangely. The colors became too bright. My chest tightened, and I felt a familiar fear rising inside me. I wanted to tell someone. I wanted to say, something is wrong. But the words never came out. The next thing I remember is shaking. My whole body was moving, but I could not control any part of it. There was no clear sense of up or down. I heard pieces of sound without understanding them. Someone shouted my name. Something hit the floor. My mother screamed. Then there were sirens. Bright lights flashed outside the house. Red and blue colors moved across the walls and ceiling. I heard hurried footsteps, bags opening, equipment being moved, and people speaking in fast, serious voices. Someone told my family to step back. Someone else said they could not find a pulse. I wanted to answer them. I wanted to tell them I was still there, but I could not speak. I could not move. I could not even tell whether my eyes were open. Then, everything stopped. There was no pain. There was no sound. There was only silence. I died that night. For me, it felt like an eternity. There was no sense of time. A minute could have been a year. A second could have lasted forever. Later, I learned that I had only been legally dead for around 3 minutes. Only 3 minutes. It is strange how small that number sounds when those 3 minutes changed everything I believed about life and death. When I became aware again, I was standing in the living room. At first, I thought the seizure was over. I looked around and saw my family, the paramedics, and the equipment scattered across the floor. Everyone was focused on something in the middle of the room. Then I saw what they were looking at. My body. I was lying on the floor. My face looked pale and empty. One paramedic was beside me. Another stood nearby with an expression I never wanted to see on anyone's face. My mother was crying, not quietly either. It was the kind of crying that came from somewhere deeper than sadness. My father looked frozen. Other family members stood behind them, shocked and helpless. I tried to move toward them. "Mom?" No one looked at me. I called again, louder this time. "I'm right here." Still, no one reacted. One of the paramedics checked the time. Then I heard the words. The time and date of my death were spoken aloud. Hearing your own death announced is a strange experience. I do not recommend it. I stared at my body, unable to understand what I was seeing. I looked down at myself, expecting to see blood, injuries, or something that explained the situation. I looked normal. I still had arms, legs, hands, and clothes. I felt solid, but something was clearly wrong. When I tried to touch my mother's shoulder, my hand passed through her. That was when the fear truly began. I stepped back. "No," I whispered. I looked at the paramedics again. They continued speaking to my family. Nobody could see or hear me. Then I noticed that we were not alone. There were other people in the room. At first, I thought they were neighbors or more emergency workers, but they were standing in places no normal person would stand. One was leaning against the wall behind the television. Another stood close to the window, partly inside the curtain. A third was near the doorway. Some of them looked almost normal. Others did not. Their clothes belonged to different times. One wore an old coat that looked decades out of date. Another wore a hospital gown. A woman near the corner had marks around her neck. A young man had dried blood across the side of his face. They were all looking at me. One of them smiled. It was not a friendly smile. "Well," he said, "look who finally noticed us." I stared at him. "Who are you?" The spirits exchanged amused looks. One of them stepped closer. He looked around 30, though I had no idea whether spirits continued to age after death. His face was thin. and his eyes looked tired. "Where do you think you are?" he asked. I looked around the living room. "I'm at home." That answer made several of them laugh. The sound was cold and unpleasant. It did not sound like normal laughter. It seemed to come from every part of the room at once. "No," one of them said. "You're in hell, kiddo." I stared at them, waiting for someone to explain that it was a joke. No one did. "What are you talking about?" I asked. "This is my house." "Was your house?" another spirit corrected. I looked back at my family. My mother was still crying over my body. "If this is hell, then where's the fire?" I demanded. "Where are the screams? Where are the demons?" "Hell is supposed to be full of pain and flames, isn't it?" The spirits laughed again. It was obvious to them that I had no idea what was happening. The strange thing was that I had always believed in spirits. I had experienced things other people could not explain. I had seen shapes in empty rooms. I had heard voices when no one else was nearby. Sometimes I knew things about people without understanding how. People had called me sensitive. Some had even called me a medium. Because of that, I thought I understood something about the afterlife. I was wrong. I knew that some spirits remained after death. They stayed near places, people, or objects that were important to them. Some were confused. Some were angry. Others simply refused to move on. But I had never imagined myself becoming one of them. I did not want to stay. The problem was that I did not know where I wanted to go. I did not want to leave my family. Seeing them in pain made me want to reach out and comfort them. At the same time, I could not bear the thought of watching them live without me. Before I could ask another question, the thin spirit spoke again. "You seriously thought hell was just fire and screaming?" "That's what everyone says. Everyone who says that is still alive," he replied. "What would they know?" I had no answer. He looked toward my family. "Hell is not always physical pain. Sometimes it is suffering inside your own mind. Sometimes it is being forced to watch everything you lost." Another spirit moved closer. "You have unfinished business," she said. "And if you belong here, you do not get to choose where you go." I felt my anger growing. "I don't belong in hell." "They all say that," someone whispered. The thin spirit continued as if I had not spoken. "You stay near the people and places you cared about. You watch everyone continue without you. You see the life that could have been yours. You watch people grow older, fall in love, have families, and become everything you never had the chance to become. That isn't fair. Hell isn't supposed to be fair." His smile disappeared. "At first, you feel sad. Then you become jealous. That jealousy grows. It turns into anger. Anger becomes hate. That is how some spirits become dangerous." I remembered the spirits I had sensed when I was alive. Some had felt peaceful. Others had filled rooms with fear. "Malevolent spirits," I said quietly. He nodded. "Exactly, they do not always begin as monsters. Sometimes they begin as ordinary people who cannot accept what they lost." The woman in the hospital gown stepped forward. "And you also have to face your sins." That confused me more than anything else they had said. "My sins?" "Yes, but I haven't done anything wrong." The room became silent. Then the spirits began laughing again. Their laughter made me furious. "I'm serious," I shouted. "I'm 17. I haven't killed anyone. I haven't hurt anyone. I shouldn't be here." The thin spirit tilted his head. "You believe sin only means murder?" I didn't say that. "You have heard of envy, haven't you?" "Of course. And you have felt it. Everyone had felt jealousy at some point. That could not possibly be enough to send someone to hell. That doesn't mean anything. It means more than you think. He stepped closer until his face was only inches from mine. You hated people who were healthy. I didn't hate them. You watched other teenagers live normal lives, and you wondered why they were allowed to be free while you were trapped inside a body you could not trust. I looked away. He continued. You were jealous of people who could stay up late without worrying. You were jealous of people who could drive without fear. You were jealous of people who did not need medication every day. That's different, is it? Yes, I didn't want anything bad to happen to them. One of the other spirits spoke. You wished you could trade lives with someone. I remembered saying it. It had been after a bad seizure. My body had hurt for days. I had missed school, and people had treated me differently when I returned. I had cried and told my mother that I wished someone else could take my life so I could have theirs. I had not truly meant that I wanted another person to suffer. I had only wanted a break. The spirits did not seem interested in that difference. You wanted someone else to carry your condition, the woman said. You wanted their healthy life. I was angry. Anger does not erase the thought. That isn't fair, I repeated. The thin spirit shrugged. You are not being punished because you were sick. You are being punished because you allowed your pain to become envy. For a moment, I almost believed him. Maybe I had been jealous. Maybe part of me had hated people who could live without fear. I had watched friends complain about small problems and thought they had no idea how lucky they were. Still, eternal punishment seemed extreme. So I have to suffer forever because I wished my life was easier? Maybe. The spirits looked at one another. That was when I realized they might not know everything either. They were dead, but they were not gods. They were simply people who had been trapped there longer than I had. I looked around at them. If this is hell, then what is heaven like? The question changed their expressions. Some looked sad. Others looked angry. The thin spirit gave me a tired smile. Heaven is different for everyone, he said. What does that mean? It is the place you have always wanted to be. Somewhere safe. Somewhere comfortable. Somewhere that makes you happy. I tried to imagine such a place. A life without seizures. A quiet home. My family together. No medication. No fear. No hospital rooms. Is that all? I asked. No. You also get a choice. What kind of choice? You can remain in that perfect place forever, or you can be reborn. Reborn as what? Someone new. Something new. A person, an animal, perhaps something else. It depends on what you choose and what is allowed. I stared at him. Why would anyone leave heaven? Because eternity is a long time, he said. Some people want another chance at life. Some want to return to the people they love, even if they return as someone different. Some believe they can do better the next time. The idea was almost impossible to understand. Could someone come back as their own grandchild? A stranger? A family pet? Would they remember their old life? I opened my mouth to ask, but the thin spirit spoke first. Do not worry about it too much. Why not? Because you are not going there yet. I did not like the way he said it. Is there something else I should know? He looked annoyed by my questions, but he answered anyway. You can redeem yourself here. I blinked. You just said this was hell. It is. How do you redeem yourself in hell? It is not easy. That does not answer my question. For some people, redemption means accepting what they did. for others, it means helping the living or protecting someone instead of harming them. Sometimes it means releasing the jealousy, anger, or hate that keeps them trapped. Has anyone ever done it? The spirits became quiet. That silence was not comforting. Finally, the woman in the hospital gown spoke. A few. What happened to them? They moved on. To heaven? Maybe. Why does everyone keep saying maybe? Because no one comes back to explain. I looked at my body again. The paramedics were still working nearby. My family remained close, though someone had tried to guide my mother away. I felt something pulling at me. At first it was weak. Then it became stronger. The room shook. The spirits looked around. The thin man suddenly stepped back. You have to go. Go where? You do not belong here. But you said I was in hell. I said this was hell. I did not say you were staying. What does that mean? No one answered. The pulling sensation became violent. It felt as if an invisible rope had wrapped around my chest and was dragging me backward. The room stretched. The walls bent away from me. The spirits began fading. Wait. I shouted. What am I supposed to do? The thin spirit watched me disappear. Live differently, he said. Then everything went black. A sudden jolt tore through me. Pain exploded inside my head. Air rushed into my lungs so sharply that it felt like breathing for the first time. My chest burned. Every muscle in my body hurt. Sounds returned all at once. Someone screamed. Equipment crashed against the floor. My mother shouted my name. Oh my God, she cried. She's back. I opened my eyes. Faces were staring down at me. The paramedic closest to me looked as if he had seen a ghost, which was almost funny considering what I had just seen. That's not possible, is it? My mother asked. The paramedic opened and closed his mouth before answering. I've heard of cases like this, he said, but I never thought I would actually see one. Everyone looked terrified. I slowly pushed myself into a sitting position. My body felt heavy, but it was mine again. I could feel the floor beneath my hands. I could feel my heart beating. I could feel the air moving in and out of my lungs. My head felt as if someone had struck it with a hammer. My head hurts, I groaned. I lifted one hand and pressed it against my forehead, hoping the pressure might somehow make the pain disappear. No one spoke. They simply stared at me. My mother was crying again, but now she was also laughing. She reached for me as if she were afraid I might vanish. I looked around the room. The spirits were gone. For a second, I wondered whether the entire experience had been caused by the seizure. Maybe my brain had created the voices, the spirits, and the idea of hell. Then I noticed the curtain moving near the window. There was no breeze. A faint figure stood behind it. The thin spirit. He gave me one final smile before disappearing. I looked away quickly. Everyone was still waiting for me to say something. They probably expected me to ask what had happened or how long I had been unconscious. Instead, I looked at the paramedic who had announced my death. I guess you're going to have to cancel my death certificate, I said. The room went completely silent. My father stared at me in horror. One of the paramedics looked uncomfortable. My mother hugged me so tightly that I could barely breathe. It was not exactly the reaction I had hoped for, but I suppose dark humor is not for everyone, especially when you have only been alive again for a few seconds. Story 5. I checked the time on my phone. 11:32 p.m. I stared at the numbers for a few seconds, annoyed with myself. I had promised I would go to bed after one last episode of the show I had been watching, but that promise had been made 3 episodes ago. The streaming service had kept starting the next one before I could find the energy to reach for the remote, and I had let it happen every time. Normally, staying up late would not have been a serious problem. I could survive one tired morning, but I had a meeting with my boss the next day, and it was not the kind of meeting I could stumble into with messy hair, red eyes, and half a cup of coffee keeping me alive. My boss had already warned me twice about arriving late. A third time would not look good. I paused the episode, even though there were only 7 minutes left, and forced myself to get off the couch. My legs felt stiff from sitting in the same position for hours. I stretched, yawned, and carried my empty glass into the kitchen. The house was quiet. It was the kind of quiet that only came late at night, when the neighborhood had gone to sleep and the sounds of traffic had faded into the distance. The refrigerator hummed softly. The heating system clicked somewhere in the walls. Outside, the wind brushed against the side of the house with a low whisper. I washed my glass, turned off the television, and began my usual routine before bed. I brushed my teeth. I brushed my hair. I checked that the front door was locked. Then I checked the back entrance and the windows downstairs. I had always been a little too careful about locks, especially after someone had broken into a house 2 streets away the previous winter. Nothing had happened to me, but I had started checking everything twice before going to sleep. When I finished, only one thing remained. I had to say goodnight to Albert. Albert was my dog, though calling him only a dog never felt right. I had owned him for nearly 12 years. He had been with me through 2 apartments, 1 bad breakup, a job change, and the death of my mother. He was old now, his brown fur fading to gray around his face. But he was still the most dependable presence in my life. Most nights, Albert slept in a large bed near the couch. Sometimes he followed me into my bedroom and slept beside the door, especially during storms. That night, he was not in either place. I found him exactly where I should have expected him to be after hearing nothing from him for so long. He was standing in front of the glass patio door. His body was stiff. His tail was tucked tightly between his legs, and his ears were pressed flat against his head. He stared through the glass into the backyard without blinking. The dining room lights reflected faintly against the glass, making it hard to see outside. Beyond my own reflection, there was only the dark lawn, the wooden fence, and the shadowy shapes of a few bushes near the back of the property. "Albert," I said. He did not turn around. I stepped closer and reached down to pet him. The moment my hand touched the fur near his shoulders, he jumped away so suddenly that I almost fell backward. "Whoa, calm down, buddy. It's me." Albert glanced at me for less than a second before turning back to the yard. "What has you so scared?" I moved beside him and looked through the glass. There was nothing there. The backyard was not large. From the patio door, I could usually see most of it even without the outdoor light. The lawn stretched about 40 feet to a tall wooden fence. A small shed stood in the far left corner, and 2 bare trees rose behind it. At that moment, everything outside looked like one dark shape. Albert continued staring. His breathing was fast and shallow. "There's nothing there," I told him. "You probably need to use the bathroom." He did not react. Then I remembered the buttons. Several months earlier, I had bought Albert a set of large plastic buttons that could play recorded words when pressed. I had seen videos of dogs using similar devices to communicate with their owners. At first, I had believed the videos were exaggerated, but Albert had surprised me. He learned quickly. One button said walk, another said food. There were buttons for bathroom, play, outside, mom, now, water, and a few others. Albert did not create full sentences, and I was never sure whether he truly understood every word. But he used certain buttons correctly often enough to make me believe he understood something. I gestured toward them. "Why don't you use your buttons? Tell me what's wrong." The buttons were arranged on a rubber mat near the wall. Albert looked at them, then back at the patio door. "Come on." I encouraged him. "Show me." Slowly, he stepped away from the glass. He walked toward the mat, but he kept turning his head toward the backyard as if he were afraid something might move while he was not watching. When he reached the buttons, he stood over them for several seconds. Then he raised one paw. Outside, the word came from the small speaker in a flat, robotic voice. I frowned. Albert almost never used that button. When he wanted to leave the house, he usually pressed walk or bathroom. I had tried to teach him that outside meant the yard and walk meant the street, but I was not sure he understood the difference. "You want to go outside?" Albert looked toward the patio door again. It was late, but I thought a few minutes in the cold air might help him calm down. It might also help me feel tired enough to fall asleep quickly. "Sure," I said. "Let's go." I walked toward the sliding glass door. Albert stayed behind me. I reached for the handle. The instant my fingers touched it, the loud bark exploded through the room. I jumped and pulled my hand away. Albert rarely barked anymore. Even when he was younger, he had been a quiet dog. Since learning to use the buttons, he had become even quieter. But now he barked again. It was deep, desperate, and so powerful that it sounded painful. "I understand," I said, trying to laugh. "You're excited. Watch, I'm opening it." I unlocked the door. Albert's barking became louder. I slid the door open only a few inches. Cold night air entered the room. Albert did not move toward the opening. Instead, he planted his paws firmly against the floor and barked with everything he had. Each bark seemed to empty all the air from his lungs. His lips pulled back from his teeth. His entire body shook. He was not excited. He was terrified. I slammed the door shut and locked it. Then, without thinking, I grabbed the thick wooden stick I kept nearby and placed it in the lower track so the door could not slide open, even if someone forced the lock. Albert stopped barking. A weak growl replaced it. I stared at him. There has to be something out there. He had never acted that way before. Not during storms. Not when strangers came to the door. Not even when a raccoon had entered the yard and knocked over the rubbish bin. I reached for the patio light switch and flipped it. Nothing happened. The backyard remained dark. I turned the switch off and on again. Still nothing. "Great," I whispered. "The bulb is dead." I rarely used the patio light, which made it strange that it had already burned out. I could not remember the last time I had turned it on. Maybe weeks ago, possibly months. I pulled out my phone and switched on the flashlight. Then I pressed the phone close to the glass and aimed the beam into the yard. The reflection blinded me at first. I moved the phone to the side and tried again. Shielding my eyes with one hand, the flashlight illuminated a narrow section of the patio and a few feet of grass beyond it. Nothing moved. I slowly waved the beam from left to right. A plastic chair, the edge of the barbecue, a flower pot, wet grass, nothing else. The light was too weak to reach the fence or the shed. For a moment, I considered calling the police. Then, I imagined how the conversation would sound. What is your emergency? My dog is barking at the backyard. Did you see anyone? No, did you hear anything? No, is anyone trying to enter the house? No, I would sound ridiculous. I looked at the time again. 11:47 p.m. I need to sleep, I said to no one. Albert continued staring into the yard. Okay, buddy. Maybe you saw a squirrel. Or a cat. You can sleep in my room tonight if that makes you feel better. The truth was that having him nearby would make me feel better too. I reached for his collar and pulled gently. He did not move. Come on. I pulled harder. It felt like trying to drag a statue across the floor. Albert's paws remained fixed in place. His nails pressed into the wood. His head stayed pointed toward the glass. Albert, I said, losing patience. Come on. I pulled hard enough that the collar tightened around his neck. He made a soft, choking sound but still refused to move. I released him immediately. Sorry, I said. I didn't mean to hurt you. He did not look at me. I'll give you a treat if you come. No reaction. 2 treats. Nothing, I sighed. Fine, stay here then. I walked out of the dining room. I expected to hear his paws behind me. Albert always followed when I left a room, especially at night, but the sound never came. I glanced back from the hallway. He was still standing in the same place, watching the yard. I went upstairs, entered my bedroom, and closed the door halfway. I left it open enough for Albert to enter if he changed his mind. Then I climbed into bed and pulled the blanket over myself. The room felt colder than usual. I turned onto my side and closed my eyes. For several minutes, I focused on my breathing. In, out, in, out. I had nearly relaxed when a voice sounded from downstairs. Outside, the word was muffled by the floor and walls, but I recognized the robotic voice immediately. Albert had pressed the button again. I opened my eyes. For a moment, I considered going downstairs. Then I rolled onto my other side. He knows where the door is, I whispered. He can make up his mind. I closed my eyes again. Outside, a few seconds passed. Outside, I pulled the blanket higher. Outside, I began to wonder whether Albert understood the button at all. Maybe he had learned that pressing it got my attention. Perhaps he was not asking to go outside. Maybe he was warning me that something was outside. The thought made my stomach tighten. Outside, I sat up slightly. Outside, then the button sounded twice in quick succession. Outside, I looked at my phone. 12:03 a.m. Albert, stop, I called. The house became quiet. I lay back down. For almost 10 seconds, nothing happened. Then the button started again. Outside, outside, outside. My irritation began to overpower my fear. I was exhausted. I had to wake up in less than 7 hours. If I went downstairs every time he pressed a button, neither of us would sleep. Albert, I shouted. Enough, outside. Now I froze. Outside now. Albert had begun pressing 2 different buttons. I pushed the blanket away and got out of bed. What is wrong with you? I muttered. I walked into the hallway and turned on the light. The stairs creaked beneath my feet as I went down. When I entered the dining room, Albert was still in front of the patio door. He looked more focused than before. His body leaned slightly forward. His nose was only inches from the glass. A low growl vibrated in his chest and seemed to fill the room. The buttons rested several feet behind him. I looked into the yard. At first, there was only darkness. Then the clouds moved away from the moon. Pale light poured across the lawn. I could see the grass, the fence, the shed, and the bare trees beyond it. Nothing was there. No animal, no person, no movement at all. "That's it," I said. "You're going on mute." Albert glanced at me as I walked to the button mat. I picked up the outside button, opened the small panel on the bottom, and removed the batteries. Then I did the same with the now button. I placed both sets of batteries on a shelf. I stood up, then looked at the other buttons. Walk, bathroom, food, play, water, mom. I hesitated, just in case. I removed the batteries from every button. When I finished, I pressed each one to make sure it was silent. Nothing happened. Albert watched me. "I promise I'll put them back tomorrow. We'll figure out what has you so nervous. For now, try to rest." I returned upstairs. This time, I felt calmer. The buttons could not make noise without batteries. Albert could remain near the patio door all night if he wanted, but he would not keep waking me. I climbed back into bed and closed my eyes. My muscles slowly relaxed. The room seemed to drift away. Then I heard it. Outside, now my eyes opened. I remained perfectly still. For several seconds, I could not breathe. I had imagined it. I had to have imagined it. I was half asleep. My mind had repeated the words because I had heard them so many times. I pulled the blanket over my head. The darkness beneath it felt safer. I tried to think about my meeting. I imagined sitting across from my boss, discussing budgets and deadlines. I pictured myself drinking coffee at my desk. Anything normal, anything real. Then the voice came again. Outside. Now, it was louder. The words carried through the house clearly, as if the buttons were directly outside my bedroom door. I threw the blanket away and grabbed my phone. My hands shook as I unlocked the screen. I dialed 911. The call began to ring. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3. No one answered. The ringing continued. I stared at the screen. Emergency services were supposed to answer immediately. Even if all lines were busy, someone should have picked up. The call rang again and again. My grip tightened around the phone. Then another voice came from downstairs. "Come outside now." I stopped breathing. Come was not one of the buttons. I had never recorded that word. I had never even bought a button for it. The voice was still flat and mechanical, but something had changed. There was a faint second sound beneath it, like someone whispering the same words at the same time. I ended the call and dialed again. My fingers were shaking so badly that I pressed the wrong number twice. The moment I hit call, I heard a scratching sound from downstairs, not at the door, on the glass. Something was slowly dragging across the patio door. I moved out of bed and stepped into the hallway. Every light downstairs was off. I knew I had left the dining room light on. "Albert?" I whispered. There was no answer, no growl, no sound of pause, only the slow scraping against glass. Scratch, pause, scratch. My phone continued ringing. No one answered. I walked toward the stairs. Every part of me screamed to lock myself in the bedroom, but Albert was downstairs. Whatever was happening, I could not leave him alone. I turned on the hallway light. It flickered once and went out. The house fell into darkness. The scratching stopped. For several seconds, everything was silent. Then, I heard Albert bark. It was not his normal bark. It was short, high, and filled with pain. I ran down the stairs. Albert. I nearly slipped on the last step and grabbed the wall to catch myself. The dining room was dark. Moonlight came through the glass patio door, covering the floor in a pale gray rectangle. Albert was no longer standing in front of the glass. The button mat was empty. All the buttons were gone. I turned on my phone's flashlight. The beam moved across the room. The chairs, the table, the wall. The wooden stick was still in the track of the patio door. The lock was still closed, but Albert was nowhere to be seen. Albert? A quiet whine answered from the other side of the glass. My hand began to shake harder. I raised the phone and aimed the flashlight outside. Albert stood in the middle of the yard. His back was facing me. I did not understand how he had gotten outside. The door was locked. The stick was in place. There were no other doors leading into the yard. "Albert," I whispered. He did not turn. The grass around him looked darker than the rest of the lawn. I stepped closer to the glass. The phone light reached him, but only barely. His fur looked wet. His body trembled. Then something moved near the fence. I swung the light toward it. Nothing. When I pointed the beam back at Albert, he was facing me. His eyes reflected white. His mouth opened slightly. Outside, the robotic voice came from the yard. I looked down. One of the buttons rested beneath Albert's front paw. Outside, he pressed it again. I stared through the glass. The other buttons were scattered in a line behind him, leading from the center of the yard toward the shed. Each button lit up as it spoke. "Now come, outside, now come." The word "come" sounded again from a button that had never existed. Albert looked over his shoulder toward the shed. The shed door was open. I always kept it locked. Something stood inside. At first, I thought it was only darkness. Then it leaned forward. It was too tall to be human. Its head nearly touched the top of the doorway. Its arms hung down past its knees, and its fingers curled around the doorframe. I could not see its face. Albert turned back toward me. His body shook violently. Then he pressed another button. "Mom." My blood turned cold. The voice that came from the button was not robotic. It was my mother's voice. "Come outside, sweetheart." My mother had been dead for 4 years. I dropped my phone. The flashlight went out when it struck the floor. The backyard disappeared into darkness. From the other side of the glass, my mother's voice spoke again. "Sam, come outside." My name is not Sam. I do not know why it called me that. The thing inside the shed stepped onto the lawn. I heard its feet moving through the grass. Slowly, carefully, Albert began barking again. The sound grew weaker with every bark. I reached for my phone, but before I could pick it up, something tapped the glass. 3 slow taps. Tap, tap, tap. I raised my head. A long, pale finger rested against the patio door. The hand was attached to an arm that stretched across half the yard. The creature itself remained near the shed. Its arm should not have been able to reach that far. The finger tapped again. "Come outside now." The words did not come from a button this time. They came from the other side of the glass. The wooden stick in the door track moved, only slightly at first. Then it rolled by itself. I crawled toward it and grabbed it with both hands. Something pulled from the other side. The stick slid across the track, burning my palms. I screamed and held on. The glass door shook in its frame. The lock began to turn. I pulled harder, but the force on the other side was stronger. The stick slipped from my hands. The patio door opened 1 inch. Cold air entered the room. A smell came with it. Wet earth, old leaves, and something sweet and rotten. Albert stopped barking. The creature whispered through the opening. Outside, I grabbed the edge of the door and pushed with all my strength. For 1 second it moved back. Then a pale finger entered through the gap. It bent around the frame. Another finger followed. Then another. Each one was long, thin, and jointed in too many places. I screamed for help, even though I knew no one could hear me. The fingers pulled. The door slid open wider. In the moonlight, I saw Albert standing behind the creature's hand. He looked at me. Then he lowered his paw onto the final button. Run! The robotic voice filled the room. I let go of the door. I ran. Behind me, the glass slid fully open. The last thing I heard before reaching the stairs was the sound of many buttons speaking at once. Outside, now come, Mom, play, outside, now, run. Then, beneath all those mechanical voices, I heard something else enter the house. Its feet made no sound, but its long fingers tapped gently against the walls as it followed me upstairs.